Hi everyone, Clint Edmondson with Microsoft. In this screencast we're going to talk about sketching out an application architecture using a layer diagram. But first a reminder again about our business context. Our client is Tailspin Toys. They're a small brick and mortar hobby shop that sells model airplanes, and they're looking for an online storefront to supplement their in-store sales. So let's briefly discuss the purpose of a layer diagram. It's used to describe the structure of an application at a high level. It's used to identify the major components or functional units of the design and their interdependencies. And each layer represents a logical group of namespaces, projects, and/or other artifacts. Before we begin drawing our layers, let's take a look at the common application architecture as described in the Microsoft Application Architecture Guide. You can see we've got at the top our users and other external consumers of our system. The first layer we'll be concerned about is the presentation layer, which may contain UI components and presentation logic components. A possible services layer if we're going to expose services to external customers and consumers. A business layer, which provides an application facade and our business workflow components and entities. And then a data layer, which provides data access, helpers, as well as service agents to external services. And finally, over here on the right-hand side, are cross-cutting concerns such as security, operational management, and communication. So let's switch over to Visual Studio and rough out an architecture using a layer diagram. So if you've been following along the screencast series, you remember we built our analysis model. Well, now that we're going to start actually designing some software, it makes sense to separate that into a separate project. So let's go ahead and add new project. We will choose a modeling project and we will call this tailspintoys.designModel. And first thing we're going to do is create a brand new layer diagram. We will call this Application Architecture. And we've got a blank surface here. So if you remember the diagram from the slide deck, I've gone ahead and created a template in my toolbox that shows exactly that diagram. Here you can see I dragged that onto our design surface, and as you might expect, it has exactly the same layers we saw in that diagram from the book. So notice down here in my tool palette, I've also got a few extra diagram templates that the Patterns and Practices group has been kind enough to provide. A mobile application, rich client application, rich internet application, services application, and finally a web application. Now each of these diagrams has consolidated the best practices from the Patterns and Practices group and condensed some of these diagrams down for us. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to select everything in this diagram and delete it all off, and we'll start with an abbreviated diagram. We'll start with the Patterns and Practices Web Application Layer Diagram template. Notice they've added some color coding to help us separate these layers and more clearly identify the responsibilities of each. We've still got our client with a browser using rendering technology. We've got a nice big gray box representing our web server. We've got a blue box for our presentation layer and components. We've got a green box for our business layer, application facade and components, and a data access layer. We've also got our cross-cutting concerns with security, operational management, and communication pre-populated for us. And if you notice, there's a nice note down here telling you exactly where this diagram came from. Now I'm going to delete that out, and I'm going to go ahead and fill in a few things we know about this system based on our requirements. First off, we know we'll be using a SQL Server, so I'm going to go ahead and add that in. The back end. We also know that we will be talking to a credit card processor. And because of some of our initial constraints, we also know that our store manager will be using a dedicated client to talk directly to the SQL Server. So I will drag that in there. Notice I dragged an extra layer inside that manager layer and it automatically expanded it. We'll call that admin client. And since the client up above was color-coded in red, let's go ahead and color-code these as well. I'll grab the color off of the client. Pop that onto the manager. Grab the browser color as well. apply that to the client. There we go. And we can go ahead and start throwing in some dependencies. We know that the admin client will talk directly to SQL Server. And we know that our client browser will talk directly to our presentation layer. Let's go ahead and throw that dependency in there. I'm going to take out the rendering because at this point we really are not really concerned too much about how the rendering is going to take place. In fact, let's talk a little bit about that. At this point, what I'm trying to do is really sketch out the architecture, so I don't want to go into too much detail about the implementation before we begin our first iteration. This is typically done as a conceptualization or pre-planning phase before your first iteration. So I'm going to get rid of some of the details inside of these layers because we're really not quite ready to do that yet. We'll come back and visit these later. So what I really want to do is rough this out at a high level. That looks pretty good. So let's start customizing this template a little bit for our own solution. So this is going to be the Tailspin Toys website. This is going to be our Tailspin Toys domain layer. This is going to be our Tailspin Toys. In this case, it's our data access, but I already know that we're going to be using SQL Server, so I'm going to go ahead and say we're going to use the SQL Server data access layer. Now, one thing I do know we're going to need, we're going to be talking to that credit card processor, so let's pop in another layer here. Represent that. And that will be a credit card service agent. Spread it out. Now we can start plugging in our dependencies. So the website will use the domain layer. The domain layer will use the SQL Server data access layer as well as our credit service agent layer. SQL data access layer will talk directly to our SQL Server, and our credit card service will talk to our credit card processor. Spread these out a little bit so you can see the lines. And you know what, while we're at it here, I'm going to go ahead and add in the SQL Server database, so the Tailspin Toys database. In fact, I'm going to delete this line here I just created and have it go directly to the Tailspin Toys database, since that's what our data access library will be communicating with. So pretty quickly, we haven't gone into too much detail yet, and that's okay. What we're really trying to do is just kind of scope out what our architecture is going to encompass. And I think we've got a pretty nice model here so far. Over in the cross-cutting concerns, we're actually going to build a layer for that, so we'll call that Tailspin Toys Infrastructure. That will be an infrastructure layer as well. So we've got the client using a browser talking to our Tailspin Toys website, which will talk to our Tailspin Toys domain. That will talk to our Tailspin Toys SQL data access layer as well as our credit card service agent. These in turn will talk to a database or a credit card server on the back end. And finally, our admin client that our manager uses will talk directly to the database as well. So let's fix that dependency. Have the admin client go straight into the database. There we go. The infrastructure layer will be used to separate cross-cutting concerns that will be applied throughout all the layers. So let's go ahead and add in dependencies there as well. See if we can line that up. All right, I think that is a good start. The next step would be to analyze the components that we're going to be building to realize this application architecture, and we'll be doing that in the next screencast. So let's switch back over to our slide deck and close out this introduction to layer diagrams. I want to close this brief screencast with some tips on building better layer diagrams. First, you want to minimize your upfront design. Specifically, you want to avoid starting going more than 1 or 2 namespaces deep in your layer diagram, especially before you begin implementing your first iteration of requirements. As you begin each iteration, take a look at the new requirements you'll be implementing and analyze and refactor your layer diagrams appropriately. Be sure to separate your functional areas of concern cleanly. and avoid duplicating responsibilities. Minimize those dependencies between layers. And last but not least, all these tips mean nothing more than making it completely obvious where the code needs to go during implementation. Here's some great references for you. First, the Microsoft Application Architecture Guide we mentioned earlier, Architecting Applications for the Enterprise, and Domain-Driven Design. All three of these provide excellent guidance around layering your applications. Finally, some resources. You can download the Visual Studio 2010 Ultimate Trial at the link provided here. I've also included the Visual Studio Architecture Team's blog. The templates for the Application Architecture Guide layer diagrams that I showed you during the modeling session can be found at this URL here. And finally, you can visit my blog for all the materials you've seen in this screencast. Thanks for tuning in.